Hi, my name is Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore, and welcome back to my bedroom. Today's episode is all about laws surrounding sex work, specifically in person sex work, or escorting, or prostitution, or full service sex work, whatever you want to call it. And I'm actually going to start off this episode by reading a Twitter thread that was posted this past week by a sex worker who works in a brothel in the UK. A message to young radical feminists who have some strong negative feelings on prostitution. My name is Lydia. I'm a hooker in a brothel in the UK. I want my work to be decriminalized, and I think we agree on a lot more than you would think. You look at my work through an ethical lens, whereas I and my coworkers are forced to consider it first through the lens of our material realities. You ask the fair question: should prostitution exist? What does it mean for women that prostitution exists? You then come to the reasonable conclusions. Prostitution is heavily gendered. Where primarily women's bodies are commodified, we cannot have equality. To achieve equality, we must end prostitution. These are fairly logical leaps. These logical leaps are meaningless to those of us in the sex industry because we cannot simply stop existing or exit prostitution. And the patriarchy would not stop existing if we did, because the sex industry is a symptom of the patriarchy and not the cause. Prostitutes do not need to just, quote, wake up to whatever ethical position you have formed on prostitution, because we are tied to our work, not because we would think it reflects our ethics, but because it pays for our food, rent, and bills, and for whatever reason, normal work does not. Formalized in a brothel or obscured by, quote, advantageous marriages, transactional sex will happen for as long as men have and women have not. The only world in which sex work does not exist is a world in which women want for nothing. There is no measure you can take to end sex work, and attempting to criminalize it out of existence because, quote, it shouldn't be legal to buy women, end quote, simply harms the woman selling sex to survive. Attempts at criminalizing different aspects of the industry have not stamped out sex work yet. An honest, impactful attempt at ending the sex industry beyond just throwing everyone involved in prison looks identical to what sex workers have been asking for throughout history: an end to poverty, money, housing, food, ability to access health, emergency, and welfare services without being criminalized, having our children taken, or being shamed by service providers. An end to stigma and access to flexible, well-paid, accessible work. Better alternative to sex work, and for the law and society to stop punishing and harming us for choosing survival while a reasonable alternative does not exist. Often, this position, the position of pro decriminalization, pro survival, is mistaken for pro client. Rest assured, my opinions on clients have ranged from downright vitriolic to neutral at best. I do not factor clients into my politics because they are not oppressed. So if, quote, but clients want decriminalization, so it must be bad, end quote, is your sticking point, remember that the best kind of feminism prioritizes uplifting and improving material realities for women over punishing men, even if the men are being rancid. Women carry the cost of client criminalization. I write this thread because I'm sick of the natural assumption that radical feminists who do not like sex work and sex workers who need sex work are diametrically opposed. I've had young radical feminists in my mentions with utter venom because they see I'm pro decriminalization and assume that I am pro client, pro industry, pro capitalism, quote, sex work is always sexy and empowering, end quote. And I know you hear a lot of us and them talk, so that's a fair assumption. I don't think all of you are too far gone to see me as a human being, like certain campaign groups are. I'm not really here to debate this. I'm actually on my way to sell pussy because rent is due on the 2nd and I'm chronically broke, so I'm not going to get drawn into an argument. Really, I just want to start a dialogue that isn't a fight. That was written by Lydia Caradona. I'm going to link her account in the show notes, but she did put her account private a couple of days after this thread because of the amount of harassment she received on Twitter for writing this. I wanted to start with that one because I think it's amazing. It's really well written and does a really good job of summing up the fight for decriminalization and why we need it and the material realities of sex workers. And also because I think it's really important for me to both learn from sex workers who are in a different position than I am and uplift their voices. I've mentioned this before that, I am very, very privileged as a sex worker. I'm as privileged as they come. I am doing this work out of choice. I'm not doing it because it's my only option. I'm not doing it for bare survival. I'm working in a country where it's legal. I have a high income. I'm white. I'm conventionally attractive. I'm able bodied. All of these things make me among the most privileged sex workers in the world. Most sex workers are not like me. They do not have the experiences that I do. So my politics and opinions around sex work are not only informed by my own personal experiences, I really make an effort to learn from other sex workers and take into consideration the experiences of sex workers who are less privileged than I am. And I really encourage everyone to do the same. I encourage you to seek out other sex worker voices besides mine if this is a topic that you are interested in, because I cannot speak for all sex workers. I have my own unique personal experiences that are going to be different than the majority of sex workers. And on this note, when it comes to discussion of sex workers and laws around sex workers, people get really hung up on, seeing sex workers as victims, because the classic way that a sex worker is portrayed when it comes to politics, at least, is a woman who has no other options and is doing sex work for survival. So people can become kind of fixated on quote unquote saving these victims. And there's kind of a gap when it comes to sex workers like me who do this out of choice. And by a gap, I just mean like a gap in understanding. And I kind of just want to talk briefly on the concept of doing work as a choice under capitalism, because I'm doing this work as a choice. I have other options for what I can do for work, but I do have to do something for work because we live under capitalism and I am not a trust fund baby. I need to pay my rent somehow. And I choose sex work because for me personally, it offers me the best quality of life out of all of the options that I have. As a sex worker, I don't have to work 40 hours a week. I can set my own schedule. I don't have to worry about my income. I'm very comfortable financially. And these positives are things that I think ideally would be accessible to every worker. I think that a 40-hour work week is inherently oppressive. I think that financial struggles are inherently oppressive. We live under an oppressive capitalistic structure. Me choosing to do sex work is my way of kind of circumventing some of the negatives of the capitalistic society that we live under. So I am choosing to do sex work as a choice, but I'm choosing it within the oppressive structure of capitalism. If we didn't live in a capitalistic and patriarchal society, I wouldn't be doing sex work. But I don't really know what I would be doing instead, because it's so impossible to imagine a society without capitalism and without patriarchy, right? So I just wanted to touch on that because when we discuss sex work politics, a lot of times we're talking about people who need to do sex work. If you make sex work illegal, people still need to do it. So you're not going to stop them from doing it. In my case, I don't have a clear one track specific need to do sex work. If I don't do sex work, I'll still find a way to eat and pay my rent. But sex work really improves my quality of life. And as a human being, I have a need to try and make my quality of life as good as I can. So, with that being said, one more thing I want to say to preface this episode is that when I'm talking about laws surrounding sex work, there is a clear distinction between sex work and sex trafficking. So, sex work is when someone is voluntarily doing the job, right? They are not being forced by another person or a third party into doing this work. Sex trafficking is when a person is involuntarily moved across borders for sex work, or when they are being forced into doing sex work and they are not consenting to that at all. When we talk about legalizing sex work or changing laws around sex work, we are specifically talking about consensual work. Sex trafficking is a different thing from sex work in the same way that sex and rape are two different things, right? The act might be the same, but the consent fundamentally changes it. So supporting sex work is not the same thing as supporting sex trafficking. So let's get into it. I am going to go through kind of the four main models that are used to create laws around sex work in the world. This podcast episode is heavily inspired by a TED Talk done by Juno Mack. I'm going to link the TED Talk in the show notes. I highly recommend it. And she uses the same layout of going through the four different models and kind of the problems with all of them. The first one I'm going to talk about is full criminalization. So, this is when sex work is entirely illegal. It's illegal both to sell sex, to solicit, and to buy sex. The United States is a big example of this. Sex work is illegal in the United States. And we know from the United States and from other countries that have implemented full criminalization that making it illegal doesn't stop it. And you see this with any sort of abolition movements. The prohibition of alcohol didn't work. It didn't stop people from drinking. The prohibition of abortion doesn't work. It doesn't stop people from getting abortions. And the prohibition of sex work doesn't work. It does not stop people from selling and buying sex. What it does is it pushes sex work underground and it makes it more dangerous and more risky for those of us who do buy and sell sex. You know, a super basic example of this is if a sex worker is assaulted while she's working, she can't go to the police because if she goes to the police and talks about how she was assaulted at work, she's admitting to doing a crime herself because she was selling sex and she will be arrested. There's no protection from the government, and the government actively harms sex workers because sex workers get arrested for doing their jobs. In the United States, sex workers will actually be charged with human trafficking when they are arrested for selling sex. Because under American law, they are participating in human trafficking, even if they are working completely independently and are their own bosses. They will end up having human trafficking on their public record. And this is one of the ways that criminalization actually harms trafficking victims, because when no distinction is made between consensual sex work and human trafficking, all of the resources for human trafficking go towards those two things because they're completely lumped together, right? When there is a distinction made, there can be more targeted resources sent towards human trafficking victims. And when no distinction is made, those resources get spread out with people who do not need those resources because they are doing the work consensually and willingly. There can also be some interesting side effects to full criminalization. In some places, I think New York and Nigeria, if I'm remembering correctly, carrying condoms on your person is actually seen as evidence of soliciting sex, and you can be arrested just for carrying condoms. So, one, this makes things more dangerous for sex workers because if they're on their way to work and they're scared they're going to get arrested and they have to choose between carrying condoms and having a higher risk of arrest or not carrying condoms and having a lower risk of arrest, they might make the choice to not carry the condoms and therefore increase their risk of catching an STD. And this can also affect the general population because if you're a regular person who's not a sex worker, but for some reason you are searched by the police and they find you have condoms on your person and they start suspecting you of sex work, that's actually going to start deterring the general population from carrying condoms on their person, which, you know, I hope I don't need to explain why that's problematic. So criminalization doesn't work. It makes things worse for sex workers, and it doesn't stop the trade of sex. So a lot of people support the Nordic model, which means the buyers of sex are criminalized, but the sellers of sex, sex workers themselves, are not criminalized. They are legally able to sell sex. The clients are the ones who are criminalized. This is called the Nordic model, which is a bit of a misnomer because Sweden and Norway are the only Nordic countries which have implemented the Nordic model. Other Nordic countries do not use the Nordic model, and quite a few other countries like Canada, France, Ireland, Iceland use the Nordic model as well. So even though it doesn't apply to all Nordic countries, it is referred to as the Nordic model legally and globally. And on paper, this looks great, right? Clients, the buyers of sex, are the ones who are punished. Maybe we lower demand for sex work, and sex workers get to continue working without facing fear of punishment. But in reality, sex workers are the ones who end up carrying the cost of client criminalization. The Nordic model does not change the fact that there are still women who need to sell sex to survive or who choose to sell sex to make a better life for themselves. It has been shown to slightly lower the amount of men who are buying sex, which counterintuitively does not help anything, because if somebody is selling sex to survive and suddenly they have less clients, they're making less money, they're going to be incentivized to do maybe more risky sex acts in order to make more money. They're going to be incentivized to lower their prices to get more clients. They might even be incentivized to work with a pimp, an external person who is promising them more work, promising them that they can help them get more money. It makes them more vulnerable. It also means that sex workers have to take more risks with which clients they see, not just because they might be more desperate for clients, but because clients are going to be more anxious about being arrested. One super important safety tool for sex workers is screening. So if they work online, if they have ads listed online, screening information from their clients so that they can run them against any blacklists and know that their clients are who they say they are. In countries with the Nordic model, clients are much more hesitant to give screening information to sex workers because they are scared of being arrested. They're scared that the sex worker might be an undercover cop, or they're scared that the sex worker would share the screening information with law enforcement in the future. So it's harder for sex workers to screen. Sometimes it's impossible for them to screen in these countries. And they end up having to see more risky and more dangerous clients because of this. The Nordic model simply does not work. And there is so much proof that it does not work. So let me take you through examples of a few countries that have implemented the Nordic model. So the model was implemented in Sweden in 2009. A study in 2014 examining the efficacy of the law concluded that it had failed in its abolitionist ambition to decrease levels of prostitution, since there was no reliable data demonstrating any overall decline in people selling sex. In 2017, the Global Network of Sex Work Projects disputed the positive impact of the Nordic model in Sweden, saying that the law is harmful to prostitutes and that it had resulted in increased police surveillance, discrimination, social stigmatization, and decreased access to health and social services. So one thing that we see across countries that implement the Nordic model is that social stigmatization against sex workers increases and violence against them also increases. The Nordic model was implemented in Norway in 2009. And a report conducted by the Norwegian authorities themselves 5 years after the law came into effect found that the model had a dampening effect on prostitution and reduced sex trafficking. However, many other academics say that there are too many uncertainties in this data to claim success. So the Norwegian data is used as evidence by a lot of supporters of the Nordic model that the Nordic model does work and it does help things. But this data is not reliable and cannot be used as a good source. The Coordination Unit for Victims of Trafficking in Norway reported that the number of identified potential victims of trafficking for sexual exploitation increased every single year between 2007 and 2012. So for the 3 years after the Nordic model was implemented in Norway from 2009 to 2012, the number of potential victims of trafficking increased every single year. It was also found that sex workers were statistically more afraid to file charges against violent customers due to a fear of being evicted. So under Norwegian law, it is technically illegal to evict sex workers. However, landlords evicted sex workers anyway out of fear of prosecution under laws that banned trafficking from the income of sex workers. Landlords also said that police would directly contact them and tell them to evict sex workers from their homes. The Nordic model was introduced in Ireland in 2017, and since it was introduced, violent crimes against sex workers have almost doubled. There's an app called Ugly Mugs, which is an app where sex workers can anonymously report incidents of abuse and crime. And their data showed that crimes against sex workers overall increased by 90%, with specifically violent crime increasing by 92% after the Nordic model was implemented. In 2016, Amnesty International released a 100-page report stating that the Nordic model laws cause sex workers to face ongoing risk of police harassment, client violence, discrimination, eviction, and exploitation. Amnesty International and most other human rights organizations globally advocate for full decriminalization of sex work. So, the Nordic model doesn't work. What other options do we have? The next one I want to talk about is legalization. Now, it's important to note that legalization and decriminalization are two different things. I'm going to talk about legalization first and get into the differences between the two after. So, legalization means that it is legal to work as a sex worker only if and when you are working within the specific laws that the government has set out for sex work. So if you are adhering to the laws around sex work, you are working legally. And if you are not adhering to these specific laws, you are working illegally. And this is why legalization is also known as backdoor criminalization, because it still criminalizes sex workers and it often criminalizes the most underprivileged and the most at-risk sex workers. So to give you some examples, there might be laws around a sex worker having to get a license in order to do their work. Sometimes they have to pay the government a fee to get this license in order to work legally. If they don't have the money to get the fee, they are forced to work illegally. They might need to get a regular STD test. They might need to be 21 years old. 20-year-olds who still need to make a living are going to be working illegally. In Germany, where I live, in order to work legally as a prostitute, you have to register with the government. There is no fee to this registration, but you are literally on a list that the government has of sex workers. We know how Germany has handled lists like this in the past. I'm not a fan of it, especially, myself as an immigrant who is here on a conditional work visa. There's a lot of issues with that I'll go into another time. All of these laws end up disproportionately affecting people who are of low income and especially migrants. Migrants often don't have an option to work legally, or they don't have the resources to understand the registrations and the laws around the place that they're in. Another example of legalization is in the UK. Sex work is legal in the UK, but under certain conditions. Brothels are illegal in the UK, and the UK definition of a brothel is 2 or more sex workers working together in an apartment. So if 2 sex worker friends are working together for safety, that's illegal. In the TED Talk I mentioned before, Juno shares a story that personally happened to her. A sex worker friend of hers had a really bad, violent experience with a client, so Juno offered her friend to come and work out of her apartment for a couple weeks in order for her to feel more safe. And one day, her friend had a client that started getting a little bit aggressive, so Juno went to help the situation, told the client, if you continue being aggressive, we're gonna call the police on you. And the client looked at them and said, there's 2 of you. I know what you are doing. You can't call the police. So they ended up being more at risk because of this law. Proponents of legalization often have good intentions because they see on paper that, all sex workers have to work in a certain way. The industry is going to be more regulated. It's going to be safer. But the reality is that not all sex workers are going to be able to adhere to these regulations. And the ones who aren't able to adhere are usually the ones who are most at risk, who are the most underprivileged. These workers end up being fined. They end up being at greater risk for client violence, and they end up not having access to aid and to resources. So we know that criminalization, the Nordic model, and legalization all don't work. They all harm sex workers in different ways. So what do sex workers want? What will actually help us? What will help us is full decriminalization. So the difference between legalization and decriminalization is that legalization is sex work is legal within certain parameters. With decriminalization, sex work is treated like any other type of work. It is a legal form of work. It has labor protections, and there are no special laws dictating like the finer details of sex work. It means that all sex workers are seen as equal in the eyes of the law. It means that sex workers are able to equally access aid. It means that they are able to access labor protections. It means that they are able to be protected by the government and by law enforcement. It means that they can work freely without fear of punishment, and it decreases stigmatization in countries where it is implemented. All sex worker run organizations that I have ever heard of advocate for decriminalization. New Zealand decriminalized sex work in 2003 because they listened to sex workers, they listened to sex work organizations. And there have been some really monumental and positive legal cases in New Zealand because the decriminalization allows for the protection of sex workers. Recently, a brothel worker took her boss to an employment tribunal for sexual harassment, and she won her case. She was able to be treated like any other worker in the country. This year in New Zealand, a sex worker filed charges against a client for stealthing her. So stealthing is when somebody removes a condom during sex without the other person's consent. I actually mentioned this story in my last episode. This sex worker was booked by a police officer. He was her client. They had sex. He removed the condom during sex without her consent. And she was able to charge him with rape. And he was prosecuted this year, and he is now serving jail time for this. And this sex worker would not have been able to press charges against this man in country that did not have full decriminalization of sex work. Decriminalization makes things safer for us. It means we are less likely to be assaulted at work. And if we are assaulted, we are able to take legal action against the perpetrators. And it means that we have labor rights. The only other country in the world besides New Zealand that has decriminalized sex work is Belgium. And they did this fairly recently. They did this in 2022, which was super exciting. So we really still have a long way to go that only 2 countries in the world have adopted this model. Even all that being said, decriminalization does not fix everything for sex workers because decriminalization does not protect sex workers from discrimination. Sex workers can still be discriminated against by banks. I actually was not able to open a bank account this year because I am a sex worker. I think I'm going to do another episode on that in the future, all about banks and payment processors and how they hate sex workers. You know, we can still be discriminated against in all these ways. There's still a lot of stigma against our work, but decriminalization is really the first step that we need in order to be safer at work, in order to have workers' rights. It really is something that we need. I encourage you to look up sex worker organizations in your city or your country and see how you can help them advocate for decriminalization. Maybe you can donate, maybe you can attend a protest, maybe you can sign a petition. If you want to understand more about this topic, I recommend the book Revolting Prostitutes by Molly Smith and Juno Mack. I am currently working my way through reading it, and it is very good. And that's going to be all for this episode. This is actually the last episode of season 1. I am taking a little summer break. And I feel like 10 episodes is like a nice round number to end on. I was actually hoping to go a little bit longer throughout the summer, but my schedule is just too crazy. I'm traveling a lot over the next couple months, and I don't make any money from this podcast. I do this because it's a passion project of mine. I don't really think there is a potential for me to make money from it because, you know, once podcast gets to a certain number of listeners, you can have ads, but advertisers hate sex workers. So I've never done it with the expectation of profiting off of it. I just do it because I think it's important to share my voice. And I really appreciate how many people have been listening. I'm getting over 1,000 plays on each episode at least. Some episodes have over 3,000 or 4,000 plays. which is amazing to me. I'm super thankful to everyone who listens and who shares this podcast with their friends. And I'm going to be back with season 2 in like the mid or end of September. I'm already excited. I have so many ideas, and I'm also going to start having guests on. And if you want to keep up with me in between now and when I come back, follow me on Instagram at Lucy Huxley X. I'm still going to be posting there all the time. And yeah, that's everything. It is actually midnight on Friday night right now because this is the only time I could find this week to record this episode. So I'm going to log off and go to bed. My name is Lucy Huxley. I'm a whore. Thank you so much for joining me in my bedroom.